In this video, we'll be looking at the growth in Nazi support between the years 1929 to 32 and trying to explain why there was such a growth. So we'll be focusing on the impact of the Wall Street crash and the following Great Depression, the unemployment and its impact, growth in support for both the Communist KPD and the Nazi NSDAP, and looking overall, why did people support the Nazis at this time. The growth in support for the Nazi Party can be seen hand in hand with the loss of confidence in the Weimar government. Now firstly, on the 3rd of October 1929, Gustav Stresemann, their popular foreign minister who had led them through the crises in 1923 and 24, had a heart attack and died. So effectively, the Weimar Republic lost their most talented politician. In the same month, October 1929, the Wall Street crash in the USA led to a worldwide depression known as the Great Depression. What happened was that, worried about a fall in the value of shares in the US stock market, American investors rushed to sell their shares. On Black Thursday, on 24th October 1929, 13 million shares were sold alone. Now this panic selling sent prices lower and lower. Shares that were worth $20,000 in the morning were worth only $1,000 by the end of the day's trading. And in all, investors lost over $4,000 million in 1 week, having a huge impact on the American economy. Now, the Wall Street crash and the failures in the US stock market had a huge impact on Germany. Ultimately, the Wall Street crash caused a worldwide banking crisis. In particular in Germany, German banks had bought shares in the US stock exchange and so suffered huge losses as the stock exchange crashed. This then led to German people becoming very worried that their banks would go bust, so they rushed to take their money out. Effectively, if a bank goes bust, you lose all your savings in that bank. So people would go to the bank and try and withdraw them before everyone else did. This is known as a run on the banks. One example of this was the German civil servant bank, for example, went bust in 1929 as too many people took their money out, causing everyone else who had not to lose all their savings. This had a huge knock-on effect on German industry. As banks went bust in both the USA and Germany, German industry suffered. This is largely because banks started calling back their loans, causing businesses, so factories, but also farms, particularly small farmers who had borrowed money to buy more land, to have to make large cutbacks, and many simply couldn't afford to carry on and went bust. Now the biggest impact of this was unemployment in Germany. So how did this crash impact on unemployment? So overall, it was disastrous for employment in Germany. As we said already, factories, farms, small businesses had to pay back the loans, which meant that they either had to cut back in other ways or simply make lots of people unemployed. Also, because the banking crisis was worldwide, German companies struggled to sell their products abroad, meaning they had less people to sell to, meaning they had less profits, so again, they would have to make more people unemployed. And lastly, because the German unemployed spent less, companies only needed to produce less because less people were buying things in the market, so companies had to cut back even more. And sometimes this is known as a spiral of poverty. As more and more people become unemployed, there are less people to buy things, so more and more people have to become unemployed as businesses get into more and more trouble. Now, you can see this in this table here, that between 1929 and 1932, there was a 40% fall in industrial output in Germany. So Germany is producing 40% less products than they were in 1929, and you can see that that would affect profits and the amount of people employed in Germany. And this comes across in this second table, that in September 1929, there was 1.3 million people unemployed, but by January 1933, that had risen to 6.1 million. So how did unemployment actually impact on the people of Germany? So the 6 million people who are unemployed by January 1933 included 40% of all factory workers, 50% of 16 to 30-year-olds, and 60% of university graduates. Even if you were not made unemployed, there were problems, because the government had to raise taxes to try and cover unemployment benefits, which they could no longer afford. So people who stayed in work had to pay more tax. Also, people lost their savings. Many middle classes had invested their shares in businesses or in the banks, and if either had gone bust, they would have lost their savings. And people who were working often had their wages cut to try and cover the reduced profits that the businesses were making. So employers cut wages, with wages only being 70% of what they were in 1928 by 1932. And lastly, many people became homeless and often resorted to crime whilst living in hastily made shanty towns in the major cities. For example, there's an increase of 24% in arrests for thefts in Berlin. The German people were clearly quite desperate. So what did the Weimar government do to try and improve these problems? So from 1930 to 32, Weimar was led by Heinrich Brüning, leader of the Centre Party. He tried in this time to raise taxes to pay unemployment benefits, and he also limited the benefits to a shorter period of time to cut the cost of them overall. However, this was not very successful because it upset the right-wing parties, as their people had to pay higher taxes, and it also upset the left-wing parties as they saw the limits as a cut to benefits and so not helping ordinary unemployed people. The other moderate party, the Social Democrats, refused to support Brüning, and the Reichstag quickly became powerless and ineffective. You can see this in the fact the Reichstag went from meeting 94 times in 1920 to only 13 times in 1932, as the different political parties were completely divided on what to do. Instead, Brüning relied on Article 48 to rule through presidential decrees. They used 44 in 1931 and 66 in 1932, showing that effectively democracy was no longer working because the Chancellor was having to use presidential powers to pass laws. And ultimately, this still failed, and Brüning lost control of the Reichstag, the streets, and the country, and resigned in May 1932, with the Weimar government looking pretty humiliated. So alongside the problems with Weimar, there was a large rise in support for the extremist parties. Support for anti-Weimar parties grew as the failure to solve economic problems deepened. In particular, support for the German Communist Party, the KPD, grew, and only 10% voted for them in 1928, which rose to 15% in 1932, which effectively was a rise of 1 million people supporting this anti-Weimar party. They had huge amounts of support from the working classes. In particular, people supported them because they promised to tackle unemployment, and people were unhappy about the falling value of their wages. However, the biggest impact of this increase was that as support for the KPD grew, so did support of the Nazis, as the middle and upper classes became scared of a communist revolution. Hitler was effectively seen as the man who could stop the communists, and you can see this in this table here. First of all, the SPD, the Social Democrats, over this time their support weakens as people turn away from the more moderate parties. The KPD, their support grows through this time as people turn to communism as a solution, but most strikingly is the huge leaps in support for the Nazi Party, which is both people turning to an anti-Weimar party and turning to the only party they felt could stop the threat of communist revolution. So why specifically did people support the Nazi Party? Now largely it was about Hitler's appeal. He was the celebrity, he was the main draw of the Nazi Party. Now people were very anti-Weimar, who they saw as weak, and they wanted a strong leader who could restore law and order and stand up to other countries by scrapping the Treaty of Versailles and treating Germany fairly. And it's in this time that Hitler becomes very, very popular. He was on every Nazi poster explaining his messages. And he used lots of new approaches, such as using aeroplanes to tour the country and the radio to spread his beliefs, effectively using new technology to give himself an electoral advantage. And by this point, the Nazis could fund this from support given to them from wealthy businessmen who were effectively scared of the communist threat. People also liked seeing the organisation and discipline of the SA. During economic and social turmoil, the SA made the Nazis look strong enough to control unrest and stand up to foreign powers. And the SA also disrupted and intimidated their communist opponents. They went to meetings, they beat up speakers, they tore down posters, and they intimidated people going to vote for the other parties. And although the communists had their own force, they were outnumbered by the 400,000 SA, as the Red Front fighters of the KPD had only 130,000 members. But who specifically did the Nazis appeal to? First of all, as I mentioned already, big business were starting to support the Nazi Party a great deal. Now, initially, the big businesses had supported the National Party as a centre-moderate party which supported their aims. However, they turned from the National Party to the Nazis as Hitler promised to target communists, and wealthy businessmen like Benz and Krupps poured money into the NSDAP, and Nazi propaganda benefited. The National Party leader, Alfred Hugenberg, was a newspaper tycoon, and he allowed Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda leader, to use his paper to spread their message. Now, the working class was more complex. The National Socialists had socialist policies which attracted working classes, but most of the working classes still preferred the Communist Party. But the Nazis did get a significant number of working class votes. Where they received a lot more votes was from the middle class. There was a Great Depression led to middle classes supporting Hitler to protect their economy from the communists, to try and stop the general worries about morality and the slide into immorality in the golden years of Weimar, and just in general to try and put the economy back on track. Farmers were also interesting. In the 25-point plan, the Nazis had said that they were going to confiscate private land and share it out amongst the people. Now, Hitler cleverly changed this to just being confiscating the private land of the Jews, meaning that the farmers became strong supporters of the Nazis. In particular, their challenge to the communists, their message about standing up for the economy, and the fact that they stood for traditional values and traditional German appeal. Now, young people also supported the Nazis. Hitler's speeches and rallies seemed exciting and offered more to the young people than traditional parties. Women, again, are more complex. Many women did not support the Nazis' traditional policies, but over time, Hitler started to appeal more and more to women. Some say partly because he was sexually attractive, but also some started to buy into his approach for a more traditional role for the women. However, overall, the appeal of the Nazi Party was not about one individual group. It was about a unified Germany which would become great again. So, in summary, in 1929, the Weimar Republic faced two great crises: the death of Stresemann, their most talented politician, and the Wall Street crash, both leading to huge economic problems. The banking crisis in the USA and then later Germany led to industrial problems and huge unemployment. Brüning and the Weimar government couldn't halt unemployment and relied on Article 48 to rule, as the Reichstag would not support them. Unemployment went up to 6 million by 1932, with many supporting extremist parties like the communist KPD. However, Hitler's Nazi Party offered strong leadership and the strength and organisation of the SA, and so they saw even greater gains in their electoral support. The Nazi Party appealed to a whole range of different groups, including big business, middle class, farmers, young people, and some support from working class and women. But most of all, the NSDAP was successful in offering unity between all groups and having a message of a greater Germany.